Hello and welcome to this edition of The Dialogue. Today we are broadcasting the dialogue from Lagos, Nigeria. I have been a frequent visitor to Nigeria for many years, and every time I come here, I am taken aback yet again by the extraordinary level of entrepreneurial culture that this country has. Not just an entrepreneurial culture, but just the phenomenal potential that many investors have recognized over the years, but still for many in other parts of the world, in Europe, in the United States and elsewhere, is a very well-kept secret. One of the reasons it's a well-kept secret is that Nigeria suffers from some perception problems. And we're broadcasting the dialogue at a time when Nigeria is gripped with controversy over the election process, and there is so much in the news about the terrorist insurgency by Boko Haram in the north of this country. What we want to achieve in this edition of the dialogue is to, for a moment, put those issues aside and look at how Nigeria is changing, and changing for the better. And one area, key area that Nigeria is changing is in attitudes towards corruption and compliance. To help us have this conversation, I'm delighted to welcome my two guests today. My first guest is Uche Orji. Uche is the Chief Executive Officer of the Sovereign Investment Authority of Nigeria. His resume reads like a who's who of the international investment banking industry. Before becoming CEO here in Lagos, he worked for the Swiss bank UBS, both in Europe and in New York, and before that for JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and originally Arthur Andersen. He's an engineering graduate from Port Harcourt University here in Nigeria and was awarded his MBA at Harvard Business School. So it's a huge privilege and pleasure to be joined by Uche today. Alongside him is my colleague Tom Griffin. Tom runs the control risk business here in West Africa. For 12 years, Tom has been working and in and out of Nigeria and the rest of Africa. And for many years now, Tom and his family have been based here. He's absolutely part of the international community that helps to make Lagos in particular such a vibrant business center. Tom has also spent innumerable years helping companies, international companies and Nigerian companies, deal with some of the tricky side effects of being successful in this particular market. So I think we are very well equipped with the expertise of my two guests to have a really fruitful conversation. So let us go to it. And my first question is for you, Uche. You've worked right around the world, not just in Nigeria, but as I mentioned, in Europe and the United States. And you will have seen attitudes towards corruption evolve. If you had to characterize how this evolution is taking place and the differences between how you've seen it outside Nigeria and how it's starting to play out here, how would you do that?
Well, thank you very much. I would say that the assumptions about business environment in the Western world is very different from when people want to interact with you in Nigeria or in Africa. The first assumption is that systems and controls work very well in the US. Data verification is easy, and there's a certain level of competence assumed of the staff who are charged with implementing this compliance regime. And prior to working in both the US and in Europe, I had worked in Nigeria. I was financial controller at Diamond Bank. And if I went back to that experience, I would say that the assumptions is exactly the opposite. You can't verify data, control systems don't work, compliance systems do not have competent staff to run them. Now, that was a long time ago, and I think that assumption continues to persist. The reality, though, is that things are changing, and things are changing quite radically. It's a lot easier now to verify data. It's a lot easier right now to implement control systems we use at NSIA, firms like yours, to verify data. So I still think there's an element of perception, which is historical, that continues to influence the way people approach business in Africa. That isn't really entirely true, especially not in our organization.
Tom, you've seen it again, like Uche, you've seen it from sort of both sides of the geographical fence, lots of experience here, but experience elsewhere as well. Is that consistent with your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting for a lot of multinational organizations. Arguably, domestic demand is waned, and companies are being forced to venture into some of the more challenging, complex and markets which are high risk from a reputational perspective. I think, as Uche alluded to, historically, there was the notion that those companies who have been successfully operating here have been too big to jail in terms of, and they were able to operate with relative impunity, and those times are changing. I think there's a much greater awareness, particularly in the boardroom, around areas such as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, UK Bribery Act, and organizations recognize that they need to change their operating models in order to successfully work in places like Nigeria.
You mentioned international regulation as one of the factors that's encouraging people to change, but I guess there's a kind of change in perception amongst civil society as a whole, in that they're demanding different things of their government, both here in Nigeria and elsewhere.
Yeah, and certainly in the last 18 months in Nigeria, we've seen a sea change, a step change in terms of the accountability of government to not embark in corrupt practices. And a lot of that is driven by social media, so Twitter, Facebook and what have you, really driving that social change and individuals expecting more of their government.
And Uche, as you mentioned at the beginning, you started your career in Nigeria, you've travelled the world and you've kind of come home again.
Sure.
Do you see a difference in how people's expectations of how their government might behave and how the kind of senior elite in the country should behave? Do you think that change is for real?
I'll agree 100%, yes it is. But I think at the core of changing the business environment, especially with corruption, is actually at the core of how you run governance in a country. And the transition to democratic government, and as information becomes more accessible and people are able to, like you said, through Twitter, Facebook, communicate more effectively, I think that's starting to drive a behavioral change. I think, one of the side benefits, one of the core benefits of a democratic process is accountability. And we're here today in Nigeria, and long before my banking career, I trained as a chemical engineer, and I worked at NNPC briefly. And the idea of an NNPC audit, now we can debate, our perceptions as to whether the scope of the audit was entirely what we would like. But the fact that there's even an audit, and that came from people asking for accountability, I think that's the beginning of change. And I want to pick on something you mentioned earlier, which is FCPA, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The interesting thing about it is, you could be jailed in the United States for actions committed in Africa. Now, that didn't happen 10, 15 years ago. Today, that's starting to change the way people relate, not just to businesses, but to government. So if you're multinational coming from the United States to business in Nigeria, we realize that you couldn't just get away with things you used to get away with 10, 15 years ago. And I think that's starting to also change how governments react and ask for favors from multinational companies. Now, this is not something that I think will change overnight, but I've been reasonably impressed by how quickly that is starting to change. And it is coming from the grassroots, where people are asking for accountability. People are looking at your lifestyle, asking questions about your lifestyle, things we didn't ask about 10 years ago. And I think that is beginning to change the way that officials carry themselves and behave in general.
And I think maybe to that point, Richard, one of the things that we've been greatly encouraged by is the recognition from private companies that actually if they operate in an ethical and proper manner, it actually provides a distinct competitive advantage for them as they seek to garner investment, institutional investment. They seek to establish relationships, joint venture partnerships with major international organizations. So I think quite a key point, it becomes that competitive advantage for companies.
So we've got a kind of multiplicity of pressure here. We've got pressure from international regulation and the very long arm of the Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission from the United States. We've got a kind of groundswell of changing public perceptions and opinion, which, as Uche rightly mentioned, isn't going to change necessarily behavior overnight, but has a sort of irrevocable momentum about it. And we also, as Tom points out, see this realization that kind of an ethical, compliant, anti-corrupt way of doing business is ultimately good business. I think that's always been hard to sell in the past, but I think there's a shifting realization that really is the case. But just looking specifically, Uche, if we may, at Nigeria, the moves that you've seen towards kind of changing the compliance landscape by the government here in Nigeria, I mean, are we seeing real tangible change?
The short answer is yes, and I see it every day running the NSIA. There are a couple of things that I think institutionally people have not given a lot of credit to, and I will say that the first thing I observed was the processing system for salaries. And I think growing up in the country, you heard about ghost workers, and today that's really something that you don't see much of. There's an electronic payment system. Two, the move to a cashless society has made data verification fairly easy. So you couldn't just go to the bank and deposit tens and tens of millions of naira without any trace. That is starting to change behaviors. You also see certain sectors where there's been some improvements. And I was studying recently what's happening in the agriculture sector. And the whole fertilizer distribution thing was a big avenue for corruption. And I think you design the systems for those. And that's to really change the way behaviors are. Pension reforms. The pensions was one of those areas that I knew people who actually will never get a dime of their pensions after making years and years of contributions. That's been reformed. So a lot of what it takes to fix corruption, in my opinion, is actually institutional. And I think it's one by one, institution by institution over time that starts to, like you used the phrase, irrevocable momentum starts to build around it. So have there been tangible changes? Have there been tangible results? I will say from my perspective, yes. But at the core of how you deal with corruption is, do you have the right leadership? And do you have the right systems and controls? If you design your environment poorly, people will take advantage of it. I worked in New York when Madoff happened. How does $60 billion vanish? Poor controls. And this is New York. Enron. So we can go on and on. It's all about how you design your systems and how much leadership you provide and what the messaging is across the entire organization. We keep talking about transparency at NSI, and we're very proud of some of the things we've achieved in that regard. But at the end of the day, it's about making sure that there's enough systems and controls in place to correct those things.
Uche, you rightly remind us that corruption is not the sole preserve of Nigeria, and that countries that purport to have very strict anti-corruption and anti-fraud regulations have seen some of the worst and most egregious examples of it in the last few years. It's a point well made. Tom, just in terms of different sectors and how it kind of plays out for different organizations operating in kind of different parts of the economy, public, private, how do you see that?
I think the notion of different levels of corruption in different industry sectors is very, very clear. Typically, we see in projects, large infrastructure projects, deals in the aviation sector, large-scale oil and gas projects as well, where there is a greater requirement to engage with government officials, state officials, or senior officials. Clearly, you're going to open yourself to many more instances where corrupt practices might be an expectation or a requirement of doing business. I think the other interesting point as well that we see within those sectors somewhat is the hierarchy, where you're working at in the organization. I was talking to a client recently who said a part of their strategy for engaging with companies on some of these large projects is only operate at the top, because we know that's where the incentive for corrupt practices is significantly lower, and they're less likely to have those demands for bribes coming their way. So quite a clear strategy that they've adopted, and has been part of their growth strategy across Africa as well.
You mentioned, Uche, a moment ago that you've got in your organisation a whole series of kind of compliance measures in place, and I think it's fair to say you set the bar pretty high, that if people want to do business with the investment authority, they've kind of got to play by your rules. How much of those similar standards do you see playing out in other organisations? I guess if you're up here as the kind of benchmark for what people should aspire to, how much of those kind of compliance processes and techniques, how much do you see being adopted elsewhere in the economy?
I would say, well, first of all, my experience across economies is very limited, so I'll be very careful to answer this. But I'll probably answer by examples. We work and manage funds for the bulk trader, the electricity bulk trader, and my experience interactions with them also show that they have similar high levels of compliance expectations. We also interact with many other agencies I could talk about, but it's a slightly long list. One of the things I see as a common trait has been a professionalization of some of the parastatals. So the leadership of these organizations have the right people, have the competence, and have, quite frankly, very high expectations of themselves. And as a consequence, these conversations are fairly easy to have. So it's starting to happen is what I would say. But at the same time, that's not to say it's or Pollyanna. I mean, we have also seen experiences where we've had to demand much more scrutiny. We're involved in infrastructure investments, as you might know, and one of the things we've done with that is to ensure that we have an independent engineering company to verify every piece of work that's to be paid for, and we have 2 or 3 levels of checks around the contractors who work and ensure that we don't have any incidents of fraud. Now, some of these things are obviously in practice very difficult to implement, but that's the best we can do. And so far, I would say it's worked quite well. So we design our organization such that across the board, no one person signs a significant size of check. I don't even have the authority to do that, and I deliberately put that in place to ensure there's a check and balance on me. And so once people realize that I'm willing to subject myself to checks, and decisions are made, not necessarily in a democratic manner, but everybody has a flat structure where you're free to speak up. That starts to, in my opinion, permeate a culture where there's enough check and balance across each other. And I think that in itself starts to set a certain high level of compliance. And I would say it's not just NSIA. The few other organizations I've interacted with, I think, are beginning to implement things like that.
Tom, Uche mentioned this issue about people's expectation, and obviously in their organisation, they've set an expectation that this kind of activity is just not going to happen. We see lots of people arrive in Nigeria for the first time. And I guess historically, perhaps they've come here with an expectation that corruption is going to be part of their day-to-day interaction in Nigeria. Do you see that changing? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's not forget corruption is a notion that takes 2.
Right.
There's an element of supply and there's an element of demand. Yes, it's very clear that there is a demand coming from government officials, coming from the immigration official who greets you as you come into a place like Lagos. But actually, your organisations that are less willing to pay money and give money up front actually benefit in the long run.
I'm going to finish with 2 quick questions that we've had submitted from people who've signed up for the broadcast. I'm just going to go through them quite quickly. The first one is from the Global Vice President for Risk for a US-based technology company. and this is looking not just at Nigeria, but Africa more widely, and I guess it probably pertains to other parts of the world too. And maybe, Tom, I'll start with you here. That's these kind of informal layers of partnerships and relationships that are very hard to verify through a lack of data. So thinking about supply chains, joint venture arrangements, interconnections between companies, and how you can, I guess what he's getting at is how you can walk in, unwittingly perhaps, into a web of illicit relationships that you've got no way of verifying up front.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a widely held perception that records and public records aren't necessarily well kept across African businesses, and we do see that as the case. However, things are improving. As Uche alluded to, a number of good public records checks can be undertaken, and certainly improvements in electronic records as well, that can be interrogated very quickly to identify potential red flags and potential issues as well. But I think as well, outside of the lack of public records information, it's important to unpeel the issue somewhat and undertake much clearer due diligence on partners, due diligence on suppliers as well, and look not just who you have a direct relationship or a business relationship, but as you say, further down that value chain as well.
Yeah. Uche, I just want to take you back, because I think it's relevant to the answer to this question, take you back to what you mentioned, which fascinates me, is this idea of the cashless economy. And countries like Nigeria, and I was in Kenya last week, and I guess that's another example of a country that is kind of pioneering new forms of access to the banking system that don't involve cash, don't involve ATM cards, don't involve checkbooks, and in some ways leading the way globally. And I guess that's another development that in this drive to push these practices to the margins of society is kind of helpful, I guess. And Nigeria, heaven knows there are enough mobile telephones in this country, must be kind of at the vanguard of that movement.
It is. And I think this is only just started in the last 12 months, the implementation of the cashless society. And I think this will, over time, make it a lot easier for people to not succumb to the temptation of corruption. Because if there's a record to be kept of the transfer, then it's not going to be one thing you like to have on you. And I think over time, the implementation so far has been, in my opinion, very effective. But I think the use of that data becomes fairly something that becomes ingrained in organizations. And to take you to your point, to the last question, my sense is that people have still the assumption that data isn't available, and that's not exactly correct. We use organizations such as yours to vet various partnerships that we're going to work into to be sure. And frankly, my advice to this global vice president is if you're in doubt, don't do it.
Yes.
Just don't.
Excellent. And just a final question. This one's from the Chief Compliance Officer of a manufacturing company based in Europe. And the question here is about facilitation payments, so a kind of specific form of kind of bribery. And I think the question is it really possible to get away? And we kind of coming back to something you mentioned a moment ago, Tom. Is it really possible to just do away with facilitation payments? And I know they're treated differently by different international regulations. And what I'm sensing behind this question is a sense of frustration that for all the talk about outlawing corruption and moving to a new and better world, there is still, where the rubber hits the road, still a frustration on behalf of some international companies that they just can't get round this knotty problem of facilitation payments. And I guess people arrive in your office every day bearing the scars of trying to do battle with the whole world of facilitation payments.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. We'd undertaken a recent anti-corruption survey of control risks, and I think 20% of those respondents implied that they had been asked for facilitation payments, and it was seen as a potential way of smoothing through business transactions. And I think sort of what's key for a lot of organizations is they set an upfront expectation with a potential partner, with a potential investor, that this is how they are going to operate, and setting that tone with the organization at the highest level, but also making sure that trickles down to the middle management team as well. So that tone is extremely important. But I think as well, businesses need to be patient. They need to understand that operating in a place like Nigeria, it's challenging, it's complex, the rules are relatively nebulous and somewhat opaque. So it does take a long time to establish yourself as a going concern, but also be very comfortable walking away from business. If you don't think it's going to pass the newspaper test, or it's not going to go through the ethics or compliance committees within your organization, then simply walk away from it.
Just don't do it. And finally, Uche, that's a wisdom that you would endorse, I imagine.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's just not worth it, because in the long run, it's going to cost you more.
Yeah. Gentlemen, we're out of time. We've raced across some really complex subjects. We've only scratched the surface of kind of modern Nigeria and how it's changing. But I think our conversation bears witness to the fact that this is an extraordinary and dynamic country, and the Nigeria of popular perception is a historical one and is changing fast. So on behalf of Control Risks, thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thanks, Richard.